What if I told you that a small, pagan tribe hiding deep within the marshes and forests of northern Europe would become one of the most powerful forces the continent has ever seen? For centuries, the Prussians lived in seclusion, fiercely guarding their ancient ways against the relentless march of Christianity. Their warriors, forged in the wild, stood unyielding against invaders from every direction. But what would happen when a papal decree sealed their fate, sending an army of monks, not to preach but to conquer? In the year 1226, the Prussian tribes, renowned for their indomitable spirit, were about to face an enemy unlike any before. The question is, how did a small group of religious zealots, armed not only with swords but with the backing of the Pope himself, succeed in erasing centuries of pagan tradition and carving a new kingdom from the heart of Europe? This is the untold story of how Prussia, from humble pagan origins, rose from the wilderness to challenge the greatest powers of the medieval world. Welcome, history enthusiasts. Whether this is your first time here or you're a returning subscriber, thank you for joining us on this journey through time. If you're new to our channel, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the untold stories of history. And for our loyal viewers, thank you for your continued support. You're what makes this channel a place where the past comes to life. Now, let's uncover the rise of Prussia, a tale of power, resilience, and transformation that you won't want to miss. Imagine standing on the edge of a thick forest, where mist swirls around ancient oaks and the land stretches out for miles, untouched by civilization. This was the world of the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, the last holdouts of pagan Europe, where the battle for survival was not just against invaders, but against the very forces of faith and destiny itself. In the heart of northern Europe, nestled between the dense forests of the Prussian and Lithuanian lands, lived fiercely independent tribal confederacies. These tribes, the Old Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, were united not by a singular language or culture, but by their collective resistance to external threats and their unique relationship to the land. The Old Prussians in particular were a confederation of several tribes, each with its own dialect, customs, and governance structures. However, they shared a deep connection to the natural world, a world that was both physical and spiritual. The Old Prussians, for instance, believed the oak trees to be sacred, associating them with the great god Perkunas. The forests were their temples, and the pagan priests, or pokanes, performed rituals that ensured balance with nature. Their traditions, passed down orally over generations, were far more intricate than just the worship of nature. It was a worldview where the cosmos was understood as a series of interconnected realms. For these people, life was not solely shaped by human hands but was influenced by unseen forces of the forest and sky. The Lithuanians to the south were also fiercely independent. As one of the last major pagan strongholds in Europe, Lithuania was united under a system of tribal alliances. They often viewed outsiders as potential threats to their sovereignty and religious identity, making them suspicious of foreign ideas, particularly Christianity, which sought to impose a monotheistic worldview on a society that embraced a polytheistic understanding of existence. The Livonians, living in the present-day territories of Latvia and Estonia, had similar traditions, though their connections with the sea and fishing gave them a distinct cultural identity. Livonian tribes engaged in trade across the Baltic and maintained a strong military presence, often collaborating with neighboring tribes or local rulers to defend their autonomy. But this was a time of rapid change, and by the turn of the 13th century, this isolated world of pagan warriors was about to be pulled into a wider geopolitical struggle that would not only challenge their way of life but would attempt to eradicate their very identity. What would it take to dismantle a world so deeply intertwined with nature itself? Would these people, who had resisted invaders for centuries, finally bend to the power of an unstoppable force, Christianity? At the dawn of the 13th century, the Baltic tribes were not isolated in their struggle for survival. They were facing a coming storm, one that had already swept across Europe and was now pushing into their lands. The storm was not made of rain or wind, but of faith, and it carried with it the weight of imperial ambition. In the early 1200s, the tide of Christian expansion began pushing northward from Poland, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire. The movement was not just religious, it was political and military, seeking not only to convert but to colonize and reshape the pagan cultures of the Baltic. Christian missionaries, backed by political entities, began arriving in the region with the goal of spreading the gospel to the heathens. At first, their efforts were peaceful. They sought converts, but their successes were modest at best. The pagan tribes, who had long resisted foreign encroachment, viewed these missionaries with suspicion. Their gods, represented by Perkunas, the thunder god, and the Dinos, sacred songs, held spiritual authority that the Christians could not easily replace. Paganism was more than a religion. It was a way of life woven into every aspect of society. However, as these early missions faltered, something more insidious was on the horizon: the Teutonic Knights. This religious military order, born out of the Third Crusade, was sent by Pope Honorius III in 1226 with a papal decree, the Golden Bull of Rimini, that gave them legal authority to conquer pagan lands and forcibly convert their inhabitants. These knights, equipped with not only swords but with the full weight of the Catholic Church, would not merely attempt to convert, they would fight to destroy the cultural and religious structures that had stood for millennia. For the Prussians, the appearance of these knights marked the beginning of a brutal campaign, not just for their lands but for the very soul of their people. The invasion wasn't simply a clash of arms, it was a clash of worldviews. How could a small, pagan group of tribes, surrounded by powerful Christian kingdoms, possibly withstand the might of these monastic warriors? Could they survive the coming storm, or would their way of life be erased forever? In the next chapters, we'll trace the brutal rise of the Teutonic Knights, their strategic campaigns, the savage resistance of the pagan tribes, and the dramatic transformation of Prussia from a pagan stronghold to a militarized Christian state. Prepare to uncover how a fierce, independent people, whose gods were tied to the very forest they lived in, were nearly erased by the rise of Christianity, only to see their world reborn under the banner of a militarized theocracy. The tale of how Prussia rose to power is one of cultural annihilation, enduring resistance, and the unpredictable birth of a new world order. In the ancient forests of Prussia, where the roots of the oak trees ran deeper than the most entrenched kingdoms of Europe, the Prussian people lived a life intertwined with their land, their gods, and the warrior ethos that defined their every action. The old Prussians were not a simple, uniform society. They were a collection of tribal confederations, each with its own internal structure, belief systems, and approaches to leadership. These tribes, such as the Sambians, Natangians, and Warmians, shared common religious practices, but they also maintained unique customs and political organizations. They revered Perkunas, the god of thunder, as the protector of their forests, but they also worshipped other deities. Vidala, for instance, was the god of harvest, who was central to the agrarian economy of the Prussian people. Zveruna, the god of forests, was also revered for the protection and bounties the land provided. These gods were not abstract deities, they were the lifeblood of the Prussian understanding of the cosmos. Every tree, river, and animal was considered imbued with spirit, giving the world around them a magical living quality that resonated through every part of their lives. In their sacred groves, rituals took place beneath the canopies of ancient oaks, where Pokanes, the pagan priests, guided the people's spiritual life. But these Pokanes were not just religious leaders. They were counselors, healers, and advisors to tribal leaders, offering wisdom passed down through generations. They communicated the will of the gods to the people, ensuring that social harmony and balance were maintained. These groves, imbued with the essence of Perkunas, were where the Prussians felt closest to their gods. Here, offerings were made, sacrifices performed, and the very fabric of Prussian society was woven. But this was not a simple, static religious life. These tribes lived in constant flux, dependent on the changing seasons, the movements of their enemies, and the shifting alliances of the tribal confederations. The Prussians were farmers and hunters, yes, but also craftsmen and traders. Their skill in metalworking was unmatched, and they crafted weapons, tools, and jewelry with the same reverence they gave to their sacred rituals. The amber found on the shores of the Baltic was more than a valuable trade commodity, it was a link to the sacred. Amber, believed to be the tears of the gods, was used in religious rituals and as a form of currency. Despite their internal divisions, the Prussians shared a common understanding of kinship and community. A Prussian man was expected to be a warrior, not just for personal glory, but to protect the tribal honor. The Prussian code of honor, passed down through oral traditions, demanded that warriors fight with valor, not only to defend their land but to secure their place in the spiritual realm. The act of battle was seen as a direct engagement with the gods. To die in battle was not a defeat, it was an ascension, a return to the divine. It was in battle that a man could find eternal glory and transcendence. The guerrilla tactics employed by the Prussians were not born of desperation, they were a reflection of their strategic genius. Familiar with the land, the Prussians used the dense forests and swamps as their natural defense, ambushing invaders and using the terrain to create chaos behind enemy lines. These tactics were rooted in a deep connection to their environment, where the land itself was a tool of resistance. The Prussian warriors were masters of their territory, and their military training was designed not just for battle but for the protection of their cosmic order. But as their oak groves burned in the distance and the smoke of battle filled the air, the Prussian way of life would soon be tested in a way no one could have imagined. How would the Prussian warrior spirit stand against the might of the Teutonic Order, an army not just of knights, but of papal-backed conquerors? Could their way of life, their very soul, endure this onslaught, or would the flames of war extinguish their world forever? The year 1190 marked a momentous shift in the crusading world. The Third Crusade was in full swing, and the once humble hospital order founded in the heart of Jerusalem would soon rise to power, not as caregivers but as warriors of faith, destined to reshape the landscapes of Europe. The Teutonic Order was founded in 1190 during the Third Crusade, originally as a hospital organization designed to care for the sick and wounded Christian pilgrims. At this time, the order's primary mission was humanitarian. But as the Crusades continued and the Christian foothold in the Holy Land became less secure, the order gradually shifted towards a more militaristic purpose. By the early 1200s, the Teutonic Knights had abandoned their initial mission to care for pilgrims and had begun to see their purpose as both military and religious, to spread Christianity through force and to defend Christendom against the rising threats in the East. Pope Innocent III, who sought to bolster papal authority and expand Christian dominion, saw the Teutonic Order's potential as an instrument of military conquest. In 1210 the order was sent to the Baltic, a region teeming with pagan tribes that had long resisted Christianization. These were lands of immense strategic importance, bordering the already expanding territories of Poland and Denmark. The Teutonic Knights, fortified with papal backing, began to reorganize as a militarized institution, using their faith as both shield and sword. They were tasked with conquering and converting the pagan Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, peoples whose resistance to foreign rule was legendary. But the Teutonic Order's mission was not one of quick conquest. The Prussians, fierce warriors tied to their sacred forests and traditions, would not fall easily. Could the knights, untested in large-scale warfare, withstand the tenacious resistance of the ancient pagan tribes? To succeed in a land as wild and untamed as Prussia, the knights needed more than just military might. They needed strategic brilliance, psychological warfare, and a mastery of military technology that would make them a force unlike anything the Baltic had seen. When the Teutonic Knights began their campaigns in Prussia, they brought with them not only military strategies honed in the Crusades but also a profound organizational advantage. The Teutonic Knights' military strategy was centered on the siege and the castle, which were used not just as defensive fortifications but as tools of cultural and political control. Castles like Marienburg and Malbork were built with precision and advanced techniques learned in the Holy Land and were designed to withstand prolonged sieges while serving as administrative centers. The Teutonic castles were symbols of divine authority, constructed to impose the will of the Church upon the pagan lands they were conquering. The knights' military might was not limited to their fortified strongholds. They were also masters of cavalry warfare, utilizing heavily armored knights trained for shock tactics, flanking maneuvers, and swift strikes against less organized enemies. This was in stark contrast to the Prussian warriors, who were primarily trained for guerrilla warfare and had long relied on their intimate knowledge of the land to launch ambushes. But the Teutonic Knights adapted, learning how to use the terrain to their advantage, employing heavy cavalry and fortifications to carve out control over the region. Their ability to organize sustained military campaigns, even in the face of constant resistance, was unparalleled in the region. The Teutonic Knights were not simply warriors, they were symbols of God's will. The psychological impact of their presence was enormous. For the Prussians, facing these knights wasn't just a matter of fighting invaders. It was a battle against divine destiny. The knights carried the full authority of the Church, and the papal banner under which they fought represented the culmination of centuries of Christian efforts to subdue the pagans of Europe. But as the knights pressed forward, the Prussian resistance only grew fiercer. Were they truly fighting a divine army, or were they simply fighting for their survival? The Prussian warriors were more than just soldiers. They were the guardians of a way of life that had been untouched for centuries. Could their way of life survive against the ever-encroaching tide of Christian conquest? What began as a humble mission to convert and heal was quickly becoming a holy war for the very soul of the Baltic region. The Teutonic Knights, armed with the authority of the Pope and the might of an expanding military, began their conquest of the Prussian heartlands, with an efficiency and ferocity that the native tribes could scarcely comprehend. By 1226, the Teutonic Order's mission was no longer one of simple conversion. It was a mission of total domination. The Golden Bull of Rimini granted the knights unprecedented authority to wage war against the Prussian pagans in the name of Christianity. The order's strategy was twofold. First, to break the resistance of the Prussian tribes through overwhelming military force, and second, to impose Christianity as the only true faith. This meant not just converting the population but destroying their temples, erasing their cultural practices, and replacing Prussian gods with the Christian God. In many ways, the Teutonic Knights became not just soldiers of the cross but agents of imperial expansion. They built castles, established settlements, and imposed a legal system that mirrored the Holy Roman Empire. These military outposts served as both fortresses and tools of economic control, providing the order with strategic positions to continue their crusading efforts while solidifying their political power. The knights' military dominance was key in their conquest. However, the conquest of Prussia would not be a smooth or quick affair. The Prussian tribes, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought back fiercely. The guerrilla warfare tactics of the Prussian warriors, rooted in their deep connection to the land, disrupted the knights' plans and forced the Teutonic Knights to adapt their strategies. This resistance, while ultimately unsuccessful, would last for decades, showing just how deeply the Prussian people held to their ancient ways. The clash between the Teutonic Knights and the Prussian warriors was more than a fight for land. It was a battle for identity, for the soul of the land itself. As the Prussian tribes fought to preserve their world, the Knights were not only waging war, they were reshaping the very landscape and culture of the region. But as the conflict dragged on, the question remained: could the Prussians survive the siege not just of their cities but of their way of life? The Prussian resistance was not yet broken. The Knights had won battles, but would they win the war? The final chapter in this saga of conquest, faith, and culture was far from over. The Knights who once fought for Christian shrines in the arid heat of the Holy Land now found themselves riding into the thick, fog-laden forests of Prussia, where the land itself would become their battleground. But in this strange, unforgiving world, the Teutonic Order would not simply rely on the cavalry they had perfected in the Crusades. They would adapt, innovate, and fight a war as much about logistics as military tactics. The Teutonic Order's early military campaigns were defined by a deep adaptation to the Baltic's unique landscape and terrain. While heavy cavalry had been the hallmark of Crusader warfare, the practicalities of war in Prussia demanded more. The Knights quickly learned that their horses, though powerful on open ground, were vulnerable in the dense forests and marshy terrain of Prussia. In response, the Teutonic Knights adapted by investing heavily in siege weaponry and developing tactics that combined military force with psychological warfare. They began constructing fortresses not just as defensive structures but as centers of domination and control. Castles like Malbork and Marienburg were strategically located to control key routes and trade networks while serving as bases of economic exploitation. These castles were economic hubs, where settlers from Germany and beyond were encouraged to come and cultivate the lands taken from the Prussians. The Teutonic Knights were not just conquerors, they were also colonizers, aiming to turn the Baltic frontier into a highly profitable economic zone for their own gain. The use of siege warfare, in particular siege towers, battering rams, and artillery, was another way the Teutonic Knights gained a crucial edge over the Prussians. These methods were not new to the Knights, having been perfected in the Crusades, but they were now adapted for dense forested areas and fortifications that were often wooden and temporary. The Prussian fortresses were susceptible to siege tactics that isolated and starved out the. Despite their innovations, the Prussians weren't defeated just by swords and siege engines. They knew the land better than the Teutonic Knights ever could. Would their deep knowledge of the terrain, combined with guerrilla tactics, be enough to drive the Knights back? The Knights' horses thundered across the land like the rumblings of an ancient storm. But the Prussians, native warriors of the land, knew how to use the thick woods and swamps to their advantage. The battlefields were no longer just places for weapons. They had become a stage for the mental games that would ultimately decide the future of this war. The Teutonic cavalry proved to be a decisive factor in their initial victories, particularly in the open fields where their heavily armored knights could charge and break the ranks of Prussian warriors. However, in the dense forests and marshlands, the Prussians used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Ambushes and hit-and-run tactics became their specialty. While the Teutonic Knights rode on heavily armored horses, the Prussian warriors were more nimble and adaptable in the rugged terrain. The Knights were often forced to adjust their tactics, incorporating smaller, more agile units to outmaneuver the Prussian guerrillas. Psychological warfare also played a role. The Teutonic Knights made sure to capitalize on their perceived divine mission, utilizing the fear of their holy charge to cow local populations. However, the Prussians, steeped in their own pagan belief systems, refused to bow to what they saw as an imposition of foreign rule. This battle of wills became as important as the physical confrontations on the battlefield. The Teutonic Order's resilience in the face of these tactics lay in their ability to reorganize quickly and leverage their siege weapons to break the Prussian resistance. But for every castle they took, for every battle they won, they faced a relentless Prussian warrior culture that refused to yield. What would happen when the Prussian forces began to organize themselves into more formalized groups? Could the knights' superior cavalry and fortifications hold against a newly unified Prussian resistance? Or were the knights playing into the hands of a far more tenacious foe? In the shadow of the first castles, the true power of the Teutonic Order was revealed. These were not just military fortresses. They were the foundation of an empire that sought to impose Germanic laws, Christian doctrine, and colonial settlements upon the pagans. The castles, built brick by brick, became not only symbols of victory, but tools for shaping the land. As the Teutonic Order pushed further into Prussia, the construction of fortresses became their primary strategy for dominating the region. Castles like Marienburg, 1270s, and Malbork were monumental in scale, designed not just for defense but to serve as administrative centers. These fortifications symbolized the growing Teutonic control over the region, and each brick that was laid down represented not just military conquest, but the imposition of a foreign way of life. The castles acted as hubs for the German settlers, farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers, who were brought in from the Holy Roman Empire. Trade, taxation, and land distribution were all managed from these castles. The Prussian people, now displaced, saw their sacred lands transformed into agricultural settlements that adhered to German laws. Their language was suppressed, their rituals destroyed, and their sacred sites turned into Christian churches. The Teutonic Knights didn't just conquer the land. They began the systematic colonization of Prussia. As the Knights solidified their hold on the land, the Prussians were no longer fighting against soldiers. They were fighting against an entire way of life. Could their identity survive this new era of Teutonic rule, or would they be forced to disappear into history, their ancient ways erased forever? As the Teutonic Order pressed deeper into the forests of Prussia, the air grew thick with the scent of defiance. The Prussian tribes, long divided by tribal politics and cultural differences, began to see the Teutonic invasion not just as a military threat, but as an existential struggle, a fight to preserve not only their lands but their very way of life. The arrival of the Teutonic Knights in Prussia in the early 1230s marked the beginning of a conflict that would span decades, but it was also the spark that ignited a unique form of resistance. Unlike many of their European counterparts, the Prussians were not a unified kingdom but a loose confederation of tribes, each with its own leaders, languages, and customs. For years, these tribes had fought amongst themselves, their internal divisions making them vulnerable to external invaders. But the threat posed by the Teutonic Knights, backed by the full might of the Catholic Church, created an opportunity for unity. Hercax Monty, a Prussian war chief, became the symbol of this united resistance. Monty understood that the only way to resist the Teutonic Knights' military might was through guerrilla tactics, which had been perfected by the Prussians over centuries of living in a harsh, forested environment. Unlike the Knights, who were accustomed to formal battlefield engagements, Monty's warriors used their knowledge of the land to create ambushes, hit-and-run tactics, and sabotage. The dense forests, marshlands, and rivers became their weapons. In these natural strongholds, Monty's warriors could strike at the Knights' supply lines, disrupt their movements, and melt away into the wilds, leaving the Teutonic forces frustrated and disoriented. But could this fluid, guerrilla warfare hold off an empire? The Teutonic Order was not merely fighting with steel. They were backed by the papacy, whose divine sanction made their cause appear unstoppable. Could Monty and his warriors continue to resist the knights, or would the superior resources of the Teutonic Order eventually overwhelm them? The Prussians were not just fighters, they were survivors. The thick forests and marshes, which the Teutonic Knights found oppressive and alien, were the very lifeblood of the Prussian resistance. The terrain of Prussia, with its dense forests, wide rivers, and treacherous marshlands, played a critical role in the success of the Prussian resistance. The Teutonic Order, with its reliance on heavy cavalry and siege weaponry, found it difficult to engage in the open field battles where they excelled. In contrast, the Prussian warriors used their superior knowledge of the land to conduct guerrilla warfare that would frustrate the knights for years. These warriors knew the forests like the backs of their hands, using the thick trees and swamps to launch ambushes that struck the Teutonic Knights when they least expected it. The Prussians didn't just fight with weapons, they used psychological tactics to unnerve their enemies. The knights, though battle-hardened, were unaccustomed to fighting in dense, unfamiliar terrain. The Prussians exploited this to their advantage, using decoy tactics, feigned retreats, and night attacks to disorient and destabilize the Teutonic forces. As the Teutonic Order built castles and fortifications, the Prussians struck from the shadows, launching surprise attacks on the supply lines and settlements that supported the knights' occupation. The Teutonic Knights, frustrated by their inability to suppress the Prussian resistance, began to adapt their tactics. Could their new strategies and superior numbers ultimately tip the balance in their favor, or was the Prussian spirit too strong to be crushed under the weight of foreign occupation? In the midst of their seemingly endless raids, the Prussians did what no one thought possible. They united. The different tribes, once fractured and divided by internal feuds, now saw the Teutonic threat as a shared enemy. The uprising of 1260 was not just a military response. It was the spiritual revival of a people desperate to preserve their gods, their land, and their identity. The 1260 Prussian uprising marked a turning point in the war. The Teutonic Knights, now entrenched in their strongholds, believed they had broken the Prussians' will. But the uprising showed that, far from broken, the Prussian spirit was alive and well. Hercax Monty, by this point a legendary leader, was not just a warrior but a symbol of the Prussian revival. He unified the different tribes under a single banner, rallying them to fight not just for survival but for the soul of Prussia. This uprising was marked by brutal guerrilla tactics, raids on the knights' castles, and direct confrontations. The Prussians showed they were willing to die for their way of life, a fact that took the Teutonic Knights by surprise. While the Prussian uprisings were not enough to completely turn the tide of war, they became a symbol of resilience. The order would have to adjust its strategy once again, knowing that the Prussian spirit, like their sacred groves, could not be easily uprooted. Despite their fierce resistance, the Prussian tribes were still vastly outnumbered, and the Teutonic Order had the full backing of the papacy and its military might. Would the unification of the Prussian tribes be enough to break the Teutonic hold, or was the Prussian dream of independence doomed to become a mere footnote in history? In 1226, Pope Honorius III, seated at the Vatican, cast his decree like a stone into the turbulent waters of Europe. With a single stroke, he granted the Teutonic Order the papal authority to invade, conquer, and convert the pagan tribes of Prussia, signing their fate to the will of the Church. This papal decree, though cloaked in the language of faith, was as much about political maneuvering as it was about salvation. The Golden Bull of Rimini, issued in 1226, gave the Teutonic Order more than just a religious mandate to spread Christianity. It effectively made them a military arm of the papacy in the Baltic. The Pope, seeking to expand his spiritual influence into Northern Europe, saw the Teutonic Knights as a tool to assert papal authority over lands that had long resisted Christianization. The pragmatic nature of the decree was clear. Teutonic Knights were tasked with bringing not only faith but order, law, and territorial control under the auspices of the Catholic Church. But the Golden Bull wasn't simply an act of religious zeal, it was part of a larger geopolitical strategy. The Holy Roman Empire had been growing in strength, especially under the rule of Frederick II, and the Baltic regions were a critical point of contention. The papacy needed a reliable force to secure the borders of Christendom in the north and prevent the expansion of Orthodox or pagan powers. The Teutonic Knights' mission in the Baltic thus took on both a spiritual and a political nature, aimed at extending papal influence and simultaneously solidifying the Church's power in a politically fractured region. But what did the Teutonic Knights make of this divine mandate? Was their drive truly about Christianity, or were they more interested in territory and wealth? Would they, with papal support, become the new militarized elite of Europe, or would their ambition ultimately lead them into conflict with those they once served? Pope Honorius III's decision to arm the Teutonic Order was more than an ecclesiastical decree. It was a direct answer to political instability in the eastern regions of Europe. The papacy, anxious to maintain its control over an increasingly autonomous and powerful Holy Roman Empire, needed an ally who could bring order to the borderlands of Europe, lands where the Orthodox East and the growing Catholic West collided. The Golden Bull wasn't issued merely because of a moral desire to convert the pagan tribes of the Baltic. It was strategically timed during a period of growing political tension between the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, and the Orthodox Church. With the Crusades failing to make lasting gains in the Holy Land, the papacy's influence over Christian Europe had begun to wane. The Teutonic Knights offered an opportunity to expand papal influence eastward into the Baltic, where Christian and Orthodox factions were in flux. The Teutonic Order was not just an army, it was a political weapon. By backing them, the Pope ensured that the order would have military legitimacy on the ground, while also providing the order with a religious justification for their territorial conquests. The papacy's move was also a counterbalance to the increasing power of the Polish kingdom, which had its own interests in the region. With the Teutonic Order pushing westward, the papacy ensured that no one, particularly the Poles, would gain too much influence in the north. But despite the papacy's support, would the Teutonic Knights be able to hold on to these newly conquered lands? Their religious legitimacy was clear, but their military strength would be continually tested as the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Poles fought back. How would these regional dynamics shift as more tribes took up arms against the order's spread? For the Prussian tribes, the Golden Bull of Rimini wasn't just a papal decree, it was the start of a cultural genocide. As the Teutonic Knights advanced, they didn't simply conquer land. They eradicated a pagan way of life, replacing it with Christianity, Germanic laws, and the Teutonic worldview. As the Teutonic Order began its crusade into Prussia, the confrontation between two distinct worlds became inevitable. On one side, the pagan tribes, with their polytheistic beliefs, deeply tied to their land and ancestors. On the other, the Teutonic Order, sent by the Pope with the charge to Christianize, colonize, and transform these lands. The Prussian resistance was not merely military, it was an existential struggle. The Teutonic Knights didn't just bring swords. They brought a religious reformation, one that would see sacred oak groves and temples uprooted in the name of Christianity. The Teutonic Order began systematically destroying Prussian cultural centers, replacing them with Christian churches, and imposing Germanic legal systems on the defeated. The ancient Prussian gods were condemned as false idols, their temples burned to the ground. With every conquest, the Teutonic Knights planted a new identity, one of Christianity and Germanic superiority. The Prussian people, once proud of their independence and spiritual practices, found themselves caught in a clash of civilizations, one they were ill-prepared to resist on a cultural scale. As the Teutonic Order expanded their hold on the land, could the Prussians ever find a way to preserve their heritage and faith? Or would the Knights' cultural and religious domination create an irreversible divide, forever changing the land of the Prussians? In 1190, the Teutonic Knights set sail from the Holy Land, but what they carried with them was not just the legacy of the Crusades, it was a missionary zeal that would become their true driving force in the centuries to come. With papal authority in hand, they would not only conquer, they would convert, reshape, and impose a new order on the ancient lands of the Baltic. The Teutonic Order was born during the Third Crusade as a military hospital order, originally tasked with assisting the sick and protecting Christian pilgrims. But from the very beginning, the Knights were more than mere caregivers. They were soldiers of God, drawn into the battle for Christian supremacy in the Holy Land. As the Crusades waned, however, the Teutonic Knights' role shifted. Pope Innocent III, sensing an opportunity to bring the heathen lands of the Baltic under the dominion of the Catholic Church, saw the Teutonic Knights as the perfect vehicle for Christian expansion. In 1226, Pope Honorius III gave the Knights a papal mandate to conquer and Christianize the pagan tribes of Prussia, Lithuania, and Livonia. This papal decree was not just a religious call to arms. It was a divine authorization for territorial conquest in the name of Christianity. The Knights' newfound mission was clear. They would convert the pagans, but their campaigns also had political and economic motives. The Teutonic Knights understood that spiritual warfare was deeply intertwined with land acquisition and the expansion of power. The Knights were not just fighting to save souls, they were carving out a new Christian empire in the heart of Europe. But what were the consequences of this papal authorization? How would the Prussian tribes, with their deep-rooted pagan faith, react to the Knights' religious conquest? Could the Teutonic Order's zeal and missionary fervor overcome the resistance of a people who had never bowed to foreign rule? The Teutonic Knights' war was not simply against pagan warriors, it was a war against an entire culture. With every castle they built and every forest they conquered, they sought to erase the Prussian past, to impose the Christian vision that the Pope had sanctioned. This was no mere conquest of land, it was a battle to annihilate the soul of the Prussian people. As the Knights marched into Prussia, their military campaigns were increasingly framed as a holy war, one that sought to destroy paganism in all its forms. The Prussian tribes had long worshipped the ancient gods, with sacred groves and stone altars dedicated to the old ways. For the Teutonic Knights, these sacred spaces were symbols of pagan defiance that had to be wiped away. The Knights, under the banner of Christianity, systematically destroyed sacred sites, razing pagan temples, and cutting down the oak groves that were central to Prussian religious life. In place of these ancient sacred sites, the Knights erected Christian churches, each one a symbol of conquest and the imposition of a new order. But this destruction was not just physical. The Teutonic Knights sought to eradicate the Prussian language, replacing it with German and imposing Germanic laws upon the conquered people. The Prussian identity was systematically erased, as Christianity became the central force in shaping the social fabric of the region. The native Prussian customs were declared illegal, and the Prussian nobility was either forced to convert or driven into exile. The Prussian people were given little choice: accept the new order or be destroyed. But despite the overwhelming might of the Teutonic Order, the Prussian resistance was not easily extinguished. Could the warrior monks' campaign truly crush a people whose spirituality was tied to the very land they fought to defend? With each castle built, with every town Christianized, the Teutonic Order's transformation of Prussia was complete. But this wasn't just the end of a pagan culture. It was the creation of something new, a Christian feudal society born from the ashes of what had once been a free and independent people. The Teutonic Order's conquest of Prussia marked the end of the pagan era in the region. But it also signaled the beginning of a new social order, one based on Germanic feudalism and Christian doctrine. The Knights imposed a hierarchical system, where the native Prussians were relegated to a status of serfdom and subjugation under the rule of the Germanic settlers. Christianity became the legal and moral foundation of the new order, and the Teutonic Knights held dominion not just over the land, but over the souls of the people. The Golden Bull of Rimini had set in motion a process of cultural transformation that would reverberate through the Baltic for generations. The Teutonic Knights, as the Pope's soldiers, were tasked with more than just military conquest. They were creating a new Christian order in the Baltic, one that sought to erase paganism entirely. The Prussian tribes, once fierce warriors with their own rich culture and beliefs, were now faced with the dismantling of their way of life. But the question remained: would the Prussian spirit survive the destruction wrought by the Teutonic Knights, or would the people of Prussia fade into history, their gods and their land replaced forever by the Christian conquerors? Before the Teutonic Knights set foot on the forests of Prussia, the land was alive with the sounds of the old ways, a blend of sacred rituals, tribal governance, and a deep connection to the earth that had existed for centuries. For the Prussians, Livonians, and Lithuanians, the land was more than soil. It was their sacred inheritance, where every grove, every river, and every stone had a story to tell. The Prussian tribes lived not in isolation, but within a complex web of alliances and rivalries that had shaped their existence for generations. Prussian society, although often seen as simple and primitive by outsiders, was deeply connected to the natural world. Agriculture was practiced primarily through communal farming, with each tribe having its own territory and seasonal cycles. Fishing, hunting, and gathering also played important roles in daily life. The Prussians revered nature, seeing the oak groves as sacred spaces where spiritual leaders communed with their gods. Their belief system was deeply rooted in ancestral worship, and they saw themselves as the caretakers of the land, not its owners. Social structures were also decentralized. Each tribe was governed by a council of elders and led by a chieftain whose role was to maintain balance between the people and nature. But this ancient, nature-bound life was about to be shattered by an unrelenting force. What would become of these proud, autonomous tribes when the Teutonic Knights arrived, their swords and crosses drawn, ready to erase this way of life forever? When the Teutonic Order came to Prussia, they didn't simply bring military might. They brought with them a complete social revolution. The introduction of German feudalism, combined with the Christian faith, rewrote the rules of how the Prussians would live and work. Gone were the communal customs. In their place stood a rigid feudal hierarchy where the Teutonic Knights reigned supreme. The Teutonic Knights were not just conquerors. They were agents of change, bringing with them not only religious authority but also a new social structure. As the Teutonic Order established their strongholds, the Prussians were forced to adapt to the German feudal system, a system that was in stark contrast to their tribal and communal ways. Under Teutonic rule, the Prussians were divided into a new class structure. The noble German settlers controlled the land, while the Prussian peasants became serfs under their rule. The Prussians were not just taxed but also subjected to new legal codes, most of which favored the German settlers. The Lübeck Law allowed for markets and towns to rise in the region, marking the first step toward urbanization. For the first time, the Prussians were exposed to a market economy, where their traditional agricultural practices were no longer enough to sustain their way of life. German settlers brought with them new agricultural techniques that allowed for larger-scale farming, but it was the Prussians who bore the brunt of the labor. This economic shift displaced traditional land usage and tribal organization, turning once independent farmers into vassals of the Teutonic Order. With each German village that sprang up, with each market that flourished under Teutonic law, the Prussian tribes lost a part of themselves. But in their resilience, was there still hope for the survival of their culture? The Teutonic Knights' conquest was not simply a military victory, it was the imposition of a new world order. With every new town they founded and every law they imposed, the Prussians were forced into a new social order. They were no longer the free people of the forests. They were serfs under the rule of foreign settlers. But amidst this cultural destruction, the Prussian spirit, though bruised, was not entirely defeated. The Teutonic Order's legacy in Prussia wasn't just about military conquest or religious conversion. The rise of Germanic feudalism transformed the region into a colonial entity, with the Teutonic Knights as both its military and spiritual overlords. The introduction of German settlers disrupted the Prussian social fabric, replacing communal farming with private land ownership and serfdom. Prussian villages were no longer self-sufficient. They were now integrated into the German-dominated economy. The Prussians were reduced to laboring subjects under the rule of German nobility, forced to work the land and follow Germanic laws. The rise of towns and markets brought some economic benefits, but it also marked the beginning of cultural erasure. The Prussian language was suppressed, and Prussian customs were abandoned in favor of Germanic practices. Yet the Prussian tribes did not completely disappear. Resistant pockets of native Prussians continued to preserve their language, myths, and rituals in the remote areas, waiting for the right moment to reassert their identity. As the Teutonic Order expanded its influence, would the Prussian tribes succumb entirely to the forces of Germanic feudalism? Or was there a spark of rebellion, a spirit of resistance, that would carry the legacy of the Prussian people through the centuries? In the vast ancient forests of Prussia, where the wind whispered through the sacred oak groves, the Prussian tribes had worshipped gods long forgotten by much of Europe. Mother Earth, the storm gods, and spirits of the ancestors were the foundation of their identity. But this way of life was about to face the violent surge of an external force. The Teutonic Knights, who arrived under papal command, armed not only with swords but with the cross to challenge every pagan belief. Before the Teutonic Order's arrival in the Baltic, the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians had lived by a complex spiritual worldview that was deeply tied to their natural environment. The Prussian religion was not just animistic but involved spiritual rituals based on ancestor worship and nature spirits. These practices were carried out in sacred groves or near natural landmarks, believed to house the souls of the gods. The Prussian way of life wasn't centered around a single temple or priesthood but rather community-based rituals that bonded the tribe to the earth and each other. When the Teutonic Knights, in their crusade to Christianize the pagan lands of the Baltic, arrived in Prussia, they didn't just bring a new faith, they brought a new worldview. The destruction of Prussian sacred sites wasn't only about religious conversion but about erasing the connection to their land and ancestry. The Teutonic Knights, operating under the papal decree of the Golden Bull of Rimini, 1226, systematically began to replace sacred groves with Christian churches. The Prussian people, once defined by their pagan rituals, were now expected to submit to a foreign religion, and the Teutonic Knights ensured this process was not gradual but forceful. But how did the Prussians respond to this imposition? Could a people so deeply connected to their gods and land truly accept a foreign faith and culture? Or would the Teutonic Knights face resistance unlike anything they had seen before? As the Teutonic Knights established their forts and Christian missions across Prussia, they enacted a new way of life for the Prussian tribes, one that involved more than simply religious conversion. It required the obliteration of centuries-old spiritual practices. The destruction of the Prussian sacred fires, which had once burned brightly during religious festivals, was just the beginning of a deeper, more systematic effort to wipe away the old ways. The Prussian sacred fires, once central to tribal ceremonies that marked seasonal changes, were no longer permitted under Christian rule. These fires, which had symbolized the connection between the Prussian people and the gods of nature, were replaced by the Christian altar fires. The rituals of the solstice, which celebrated the Earth's cycle of life, were banned, and instead, the Christian calendar became the new measure of time. Christmas, Easter, and saints' feast days replaced pagan harvest celebrations, enforcing a cultural transformation that went beyond religion. The Teutonic Knights didn't just convert souls. They imposed a new way of life where Christian values replaced pagan traditions. But the destruction of pagan rituals was more than just religious. It was cultural. The Teutonic Order, through their aggressive missionary work, undermined the Prussian spiritual autonomy and imposed a feudal system that centralized power in the hands of German settlers and the Teutonic nobility. Prussian culture, once so deeply rooted in a communal pagan worldview, now had to navigate a feudal hierarchy that placed them at the bottom of the social ladder. Christianity wasn't just about salvation, it was about the domination of the Prussian people's way of life. As the old world of the Prussians was replaced by a Christian feudal order, would the Prussian spirit, so deeply tied to their pagan gods, fade into history, or could it resist the waves of change? The rise of Christianity in Prussia under the Teutonic Order was not only a shift in religious belief, it was a complete reorganization of time itself. The Christian calendar, with its emphasis on saints' feast days, holy weeks, and church holidays, became the new rhythm by which life in Prussia was measured. For the Prussians, whose sense of time had once been governed by the cycles of nature, this new system was both an alien imposition and a way of life they were forced to accept. The practical impact of the Christian calendar was far-reaching. Feasts, once centered on the primal gods of nature, now followed the Christian observances: Easter, All Saints' Day, Christmas. The Teutonic Knights were not just missionaries, they were architects of a new temporal order. The Prussian people, who had once celebrated the solstices, equinoxes, and harvest festivals, now had their lives dictated by the Christian faith's seasons. This was not simply a shift in religion, it was a restructuring of daily existence. Where once the harvest festival was an occasion to honor pagan gods, it was now a time to celebrate the birth of Christ. The feasts of saints and the annual Christian rituals became a fixture of Prussian life, replacing the old pagan festivals. But for the Prussians, this transformation was more than just a shift in what they celebrated. It was a deep alienation from the land that had once connected them to their gods. Now the seasons were marked by a foreign calendar, and the rituals that once celebrated life and nature were now transformed into a form of worship that centered on Catholic doctrine and the papacy. As Christianity gained ground, did the Prussian people ever retain the ancient wisdom and practices that had been their connection to the land? Or was the shift into a Christian world complete, leaving nothing but traces of the pagan past in the depths of the forest? In the heart of Prussia, the towering Marienburg arose from the earth, its massive walls casting long shadows over the once untamed wilderness. What started as a military stronghold quickly morphed into a symbol of Teutonic dominance, encapsulating not just the order's military might but its economic control and its deep entanglement with papal authority. The construction of Marienburg was not simply a military necessity but a strategic maneuver designed to showcase the Teutonic Knights' supremacy. Positioned in a strategic location, it offered a commanding view of the surrounding terrain, a perfect spot to control trade routes and defend against Prussian uprisings. The castle served as a base of operations for the knights, who used it to coordinate their political, religious, and economic activities. However, Marienburg wasn't just an imposing structure, it was a psychological weapon. Its towering stone walls were a clear message to the Prussians: resistance was futile. With the construction of such fortresses, the Teutonic Order began to integrate military strength with a new administrative structure, allowing them to consolidate power over both the land and the people. Inside the castle, military commanders, priests, and bureaucrats worked together to rule Prussia, a system that blended religious and secular authority in a way unseen in many parts of Europe at the time. But as the Teutonic Order fortified their castles, another question lingered: could the Prussian tribes, a people rooted in independence and ancient rituals, ever accept this foreign order, or would they continue to resist, even from the shadows of these towering castles? By the time the last of the Prussian tribes had been subdued, the Teutonic Order had already begun transforming from conquerors to governors. The knights were no longer merely fighting warriors, they were now feudal lords ruling over the lands they had once invaded. The administrative mechanisms they created laid the foundation for a new world order, one where German settlers became the new ruling elite and the Prussians were relegated to the roles of serfs and peasants. With the Teutonic conquest complete, the order began to impose Germanic feudalism, marking a stark departure from the tribal governance of the Prussian people. Land was granted to German settlers under the Lübeck Law, a framework that not only encouraged the establishment of towns and markets but also established a rigid class hierarchy. Prussian nobility were either driven into exile, converted, or made vassals of their Teutonic overlords, while the Germanic settlers quickly rose to prominence as the new landowners. The knights now governed with papal authority, enforcing Christian morality alongside feudal justice. This transition to feudalism fundamentally altered Prussian society. The Prussian peasants, once free to work the land communally, were now forced into serfdom under the control of Germanic lords. Work was no longer determined by tribal customs but by the laws of the Teutonic Knights, whose legal system demanded that all Prussians bow to their rule. This new system, blending religious obedience with feudal servitude, would serve as the foundation of the Teutonic Order's rule in Prussia for centuries. But amidst the imposition of this feudal system, could the Prussian tribes ever reclaim their ancestral rights? Was there a flicker of hope left for the Prussian identity, or had it been irreversibly destroyed by the weight of Germanic feudalism? The Teutonic Knights were not just warriors, they were priests, and their castles were not just fortresses, they were centers of religious and secular control. The fusion of military power with religious authority created a system unlike any other in medieval Europe. The knights were both divine representatives and feudal lords, and their government was an expression of this duality. Unlike other feudal states, the Teutonic Knights had the unique distinction of being a militarized theocracy. Their rule was not simply secular but intertwined with papal authority, as they saw themselves as divinely ordained rulers. Marienburg and other castles served as fortified centers of power, where both secular lords and priests worked together to maintain control. Religious laws were just as important as military commands in this new system, and the Teutonic Knights enforced both with equal fervor. This religious and military union was not only seen in the fortresses but also in the governance of Prussia. The priest knights conducted Christian services while also overseeing tax collection and military recruitment. The militarized administrative state they created helped to keep the Prussian people in check, all while ensuring that Christian morality was the guiding principle of daily life. This blending of church and state would come to define the Teutonic Order's rule for centuries to come. But could the Prussian tribes, whose very identity was shaped by the land and their gods, ever adapt to this militarized, Christianized society? Or was this the final death knell for their ancient way of life? The Teutonic Knights did not conquer Prussia with only their swords. They brought with them the promise of land, wealth, and a new way of life. The settlers who followed were not merely adventurers but pragmatic men and women seeking economic opportunities. With each new settlement and each new farm, they began to build a new world, one where the Prussian landscape was transformed and its native culture steadily erased. When the Teutonic Knights began their campaign of settlement in the 1270s, they didn't just bring German settlers to pristine lands. They brought the weight of their feudal ambitions and the promise of prosperity. The Germanic settlers, comprising farmers, artisans, and merchants, arrived in waves. Some were eager for land grants, others sought the protection of the knights in exchange for service. The Lübeck Law, implemented by the Teutonic Order, offered these settlers legal privileges and tax exemptions, making it highly attractive to many Germans who had been displaced by wars or poverty. While these settlers were meant to integrate into the region, their presence came with an overwhelming economic transformation. They introduced new agricultural techniques, replacing the traditional Prussian farming methods with more Germanic practices. Crop rotation, advanced plowing systems, and the cultivation of wheat, barley, and rye became central to the new economy. However, this wasn't a perfect transition. Settlers often struggled with the wetland soils and harsh climate of Prussia. They had to rely on native Prussians, who had a deep understanding of the local land and its unpredictable rhythms. But was this process of economic adaptation truly a peaceful exchange of knowledge, or did the Prussian tribes use their own methods of survival to resist the encroaching settlers? Could these indigenous practices hold the key to maintaining a semblance of Prussian culture? As towns like Thorn and Gdansk began to emerge, their bustling markets and Lübeck-based economies became not just symbols of Teutonic power but of a new world order. The Prussian tribes now found themselves caught in a web of German laws, Christian festivals, and German customs, all designed to turn them from free men into vassals and serfs. The Teutonic Knights imposed their Germanic culture through legal systems, towns, and Christianity. The new settlers were not simply farming the land. they were building a new economy based on trade and urban life. The towns of Prussia began to thrive under the protection of Teutonic Knights, which brought prosperity, but with a price. The Prussian peasants who had once worked the land communally were now serfs under a feudal system that was foreign to them. German merchants flooded the marketplaces, trading amber, timber, and grain from Prussia in exchange for luxury goods and manufactured products from the West. The Hanseatic League, whose members were Germanic traders, played a pivotal role in integrating the newly settled Prussian economy into wider European trade networks. These trade privileges were granted to the German settlers in exchange for loyalty to the Teutonic Order, but they also began to displace native economic systems. Prussian merchants, once central to local barter economies, were increasingly sidelined, their livelihoods undermined by the German monopolies that controlled Prussian trade. Yet, despite the rise of Germanic towns and markets, could there still be Prussian pockets of resistance? Were the practices of the German settlers truly sustainable, or would the Prussian landscape itself, untamed and ancient, offer a secret resistance to their dominance? Once bound to the ancient rhythms of the land, the Prussian tribes now found themselves swept up in the new Germanic feudal system. What had once been communal farming became feudal exploitation, with the Teutonic settlers owning the land and the native Prussians bound to it as serfs. The Teutonic settlers brought German agricultural practices that forever changed the Prussian countryside. New crops were introduced, including wheat and barley, while livestock like pigs and cattle were bred in greater numbers. The Prussian farming system, which had once been communal and closely tied to nature's rhythms, was replaced with a more efficient, profitable system that emphasized private ownership and production for trade. However, this shift came at the expense of Prussian autonomy. Feudal serfdom became the foundation of the economic system, where the Prussian peasants were forced to work the land for the German settlers who now controlled the region. The introduction of Germanic feudalism brought a severe economic shift. The Prussian tribes, who had once been self-sufficient, now worked under the supervision of German lords, often living in poverty while the German settlers prospered. The priest knights who had once come to Christianize the Prussians now found themselves enmeshed in the task of maintaining feudal control over the land and its people, ensuring that the serfs worked the land to support the Teutonic Order's growing wealth and power. As the Prussians endured under the feudal system, did they begin to see themselves as serfs under foreign rule? Or did they find a way to adapt their culture and identity amidst these drastic changes? For the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, the oak tree was not merely wood, it was the home of the gods, the beacon of life, and the very soul of the land. As these ancient tribes roamed the dense forests of Prussia, they carried within them the ancient belief that the spiritual realm was not something far removed but deeply intertwined with the earth itself. Here, beneath the thick canopy of oak trees, they worshipped the gods of thunder, earth, and fire in sacred groves, the heart of their identity. Before the Teutonic Order arrived, the Prussian tribes worshipped the gods that had once walked among them, in the forests they had lived within for centuries. The oak groves were seen as sacred altars, where the gods themselves were believed to dwell. These ancient rituals of fire worship and ancestor veneration formed the core of their spiritual life, and the sacred fires, which blazed during important rites like the solstices, were thought to keep the gods alive in their presence. The rituals performed here were not just acts of worship. They were the very foundation of the Prussian community, keeping the tribe connected to the divine forces of the world. The introduction of Christianity by the Teutonic Knights would, however, seek to replace this deeply entrenched belief system. The Christian cross was meant to wipe away the ancient ways, The sacred groves were not only destroyed but transformed into Christian shrines, and in their place the Teutonic Knights built churches and crosses, forcing a new identity upon the Prussian people. Could the ancient Prussian gods, their power now buried beneath the weight of the cross, ever be reborn? Or would the flames of their sacred fires be forever extinguished by the Knights' conquest? As the Teutonic Order advanced deeper into Prussian territory, the destruction of sacred groves was swift and thorough. Where once the Prussian people had worshipped in their ancient sanctuaries, they now faced foreign crosses planted on the very soil they had worshipped on. The Teutonic Knights brought not only the cross, but Christian festivals, which would replace the ancient pagan calendar that had once governed Prussian life. Where the summer solstice had been celebrated in honor of the sun god, now Christian feast days were set to mark the cycle of life. The Teutonic Order sought to eradicate not just the Prussian gods but the entire spiritual infrastructure that had held the Prussian tribes together for centuries. Pagan rituals were now considered blasphemous, and pagan temples were forcibly converted into Christian churches. Saints' feast days replaced the old harvest festivals, and where the Prussians once gathered to honor their gods, they now gathered to listen to Christian priests preach from foreign scriptures. The Teutonic Knights had not only conquered the land, they had begun the monumental task of replacing an entire worldview. Yet, despite the forced Christianization, pagan practices didn't vanish entirely. Prussian women, as the guardians of tradition, kept the oral histories of their people alive, often in secret. These stories, rooted in oak groves and sacred fires, would continue to pass down through the generations, even as the official narrative shifted. The Prussian identity was not so easily erased. It adapted, hiding its roots beneath the surface of Christian practice. How did the Prussian people, so deeply tied to the land and its ancient deities, navigate the challenges of Christianization? Could their pagan heritage survive, or would they become unwitting subjects of a foreign faith? In the shadows of the Teutonic Order's churches, the old ways didn't vanish as easily as the Knights had hoped. Prussian resistance was not only military, it was spiritual. Hidden from the eyes of the Knights, pagan practices endured, quietly adapting, merging with Christian beliefs in subtle yet significant ways. As Christian feast days supplanted pagan festivals, some of the old gods found their place in the Christian pantheon, blending into the worship of saints. Despite the Teutonic Knights' efforts, the Prussian identity found ways to survive beneath the surface. Even as the priest knights worked to impose Christian order, the Prussian tribes found ways to merge old practices with the new religion. Feasts and rituals once dedicated to the gods of the oak were syncretized into Christian holidays. The pagan gods were now seen through a Christian lens, with many Prussian customs, like those surrounding the solstice and harvest, incorporating Christian imagery but still carrying echoes of the old faith. But could the Teutonic Knights ever fully control the Prussian spirit? As Prussian identity began to merge with Christianity, did the Prussian people still carry their pagan gods within them, waiting for the right moment to reclaim their heritage? The Teutonic Knights were not simply soldiers. They were vessels of divine will, sent by the Pope to conquer and convert the heathen lands of the Baltic. Their mission was divinely sanctioned, yet it was also deeply entangled with the politics of territorial control and feudal expansion. This was a conquest of both the land and the spirit, one that sought to shape not just the territory but the very identity of the Prussian tribes. The Teutonic Knights arose from the Third Crusade, formed to fight for Christendom in the Holy Land. However, when their mission in the East became untenable, the Teutonic Order refocused its efforts on the Baltic, where pagan tribes still clung to their ancient ways. This shift in direction was not just about religious zeal. It was a strategic move to extend Christian influence and territorial power. The papal bull of Rimini, 1226, gave the Teutonic Knights the legal authority to conquer the pagan lands of Prussia, granting them the divine right to fight in God's name. But the Teutonic mission was not just a religious pursuit, it was a political strategy. The Pope's decree empowered the order to establish a militarized state in Prussia, one where both religion and secular authority were intertwined. The Teutonic Knights were not only soldiers, they were also priests, responsible for the spiritual well-being of the lands they conquered. The cross they carried symbolized both their holy war and their military dominion over the Baltic tribes. But could the Teutonic Order, so deeply bound by their divine mission, ever be completely loyal to the Pope? Or would their feudal ambitions drive them to seek greater autonomy in the Baltic than even the papal authority could grant? As the Teutonic Knights began to assert their dominance over Prussia, their rule was not merely feudal, it was a militarized theocracy, a state where the cross and the sword were indistinguishable. The knights were not only military leaders but also religious authorities, wielding both feudal power and papal sanction in a way that had never been seen before. The Prussian tribes, once free, now found themselves living under the rule of priests and warriors alike, as the knights built not just fortresses but also a new feudal order. The Teutonic Order's feudal system in Prussia was unique in that it merged religious authority with secular control. The papal bull granted the knights control over Prussian lands, allowing them to govern as both lords and priests. The military orders governed the Prussian people with theocratic zeal, enforcing Christian law while also collecting taxes, establishing economic privileges and imposing military service. The Teutonic Order created a state that was more than just military rule. It was a society where the church was as powerful as the army, and where religion served as the backbone of feudal control. The Teutonic state was ruled by priests and warrior lords who acted as both religious leaders and feudal overlords, blending their military strategies with divine mandates. They built castles and fortresses that were not just military outposts but also symbols of Christian authority. Each brick laid down was a step toward turning the Prussian lands into a land where God's will was law. But what happens when religious zeal and feudal ambition collide? Would the Teutonic Order's military theocracy be able to maintain its unified front, or would internal conflicts tear apart the delicate balance between faith and feudalism? The Teutonic Order's rule in Prussia was not just a conquest of land, but of identity, theirs and the Prussians. Their military theocracy left an indelible mark on the region, transforming not just the landscape, but the very spiritual fabric of the people. The Teutonic Knights imposed Christianity on the Prussians, but in doing so, they also left behind a legacy of military control, feudal obligation, and religious authority that would endure long after their conquest. The Teutonic Knights laid the foundations for a new world order in the Baltic, where religion and military power were inseparable. The Knights' rule created a unique militarized society, one in which the feudal system was deeply intertwined with Christianity. Prussian culture was transformed through theocracy, as Germanic settlers replaced the native tribes, while Christianity replaced pagan traditions. In many ways, the Teutonic Order's rule was both a spiritual war and a political conquest, forging an empire where God was the ultimate ruler, but it was the knights who wielded the sword. As the Prussians were integrated into this new state, the Teutonic Order laid the groundwork for lasting control. The knights taught and dictated the way of life, imposing Christian laws, demanding fealty from the Prussians, and settling the land with Germanic settlers. But the legacy of their rule was more than just the conquest of Prussia. It was the creation of a militarized state, one that combined religious control with feudal dominance, an empire forged not just through the sword but through the cross. As the Teutonic Order advanced across the Prussian and Lithuanian lands, one might assume that pagan resistance would eventually falter beneath the might of the Order's knights and their superior weaponry. However, this is where history veers from the expected. The Prussian tribes fought with more than just arms. They fought with their heritage, identity, and spirituality. It was a war that went beyond the physical. It was a battle for the very soul of the land, where oak groves, sacred fires, and tribal warriors stood against the militarized theocracy of the Teutonic Order. The pagan strongholds of Prussia, scattered throughout the dense forests and marshlands, were not just military fortresses. They were the last bastions of Prussian identity, a cultural resistance that had survived for centuries. Prussian leaders like Hercax Monti knew that the Teutonic Knights were not just conquerors, but agents of religious destruction, tasked with obliterating Prussian culture. The proud pagan tribes of the Samland, Sambia, and Curonia employed guerrilla tactics to slow the Teutonic advance, striking at night, ambushing convoys, and cutting off supply lines. They leveraged the dense forests and swamps, using the terrain to their advantage, a sharp contrast to the heavy cavalry of the Teutonic Knights. However, despite the resilience and determination of the Prussian resistance, the superior fortifications and siege technology of the Teutonic Knights eventually took their toll. The fortresses of the Teutonic Knights, such as Marienburg Castle, were more than military bastions. They were symbols of the Teutonic state's dominance. The knights' castles served as both strongholds and centers of governance, where the knights not only commanded armies but also imposed Christian rule over the subjugated lands. The Day of Grunwald, July 15, 1410, remains etched into the history of the Baltic. It was the battle where the Teutonic Order, once a dominating force, faced a coalition of forces that threatened to tear their entire empire apart. On one side stood the Polish-Lithuanian alliance, supported by Tatar forces, and on the other the Teutonic Knights, entrenched in their belief of divine right. The outcome of this battle would not only alter the military landscape of the region but would shake the very foundation of Teutonic power. The Battle of Grunwald was an overwhelming Polish-Lithuanian victory that shifted the balance of power in Eastern Europe. The Teutonic Knights, led by Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, were overconfident, relying on traditional cavalry tactics to decisively crush their opponents. However, the Polish-Lithuanian forces, commanded by King Władysław Jagiello and Vytautas the Great, employed a more flexible, innovative strategy. They lured the Teutonic Knights into a false sense of security, then unleashed a devastating counteroffensive, enveloping the Teutonic forces and breaking their lines. The Teutonic Knights' loss was not just a military defeat, it was a crushing blow to their credibility and authority. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen was killed in battle, a symbolic loss of leadership that fractured the order's unity. In the aftermath of Grunwald, the Teutonic Knights were forced to retreat to their fortresses, and their dominance in Prussia began to erode. Poland and Lithuania capitalized on the victory, pushing further into the Baltic region, weakening the Teutonic strongholds. While the Teutonic Knights were not vanquished outright, their defeat at Grunwald signaled the beginning of their decline. In the years following the battle, the Teutonic Order struggled to maintain control over Prussia. The loss of military prestige, coupled with internal divisions, marked the beginning of a long political collapse. Despite their defeat at Grunwald, the Teutonic Order continued to hold territory but at a weakened state. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance saw Grunwald as a crucial turning point, and the Teutonic Knights were no longer viewed as an unstoppable military force. Over the following decades, the Teutonic Order faced internal political strife and external pressure from neighboring states. The Treaty of Thorn, 1466, would later further reduce the Order's holdings, with Prussia split into a duchy under the Polish crown, signaling the formal end of the Teutonic Knights' reign in the Baltic. It was in the wake of their victories, the constant expansion, the relentless sieges, the fortifications rising on every hill, that the Teutonic Knights began to feel the crushing weight of their success. The glory of conquest, once a symbol of divine favor, was slowly replaced with the harsh reality of economic strain. For the Knights, military campaigns that were once a source of wealth and territorial gain now became an insatiable drain on the coffers of the Order. In the early stages of their conquest, the Teutonic Order relied on the papal authority to sustain their military endeavors and feudal system. However, as the Prussian lands were conquered and Christianized, the Teutonic Knights faced an increasing economic burden. The construction of fortresses like Marienburg, begun in the 1270s, and the expansion of military infrastructure came at an enormous cost. Hunsberg, Zara, and other strongholds were costly to maintain, and the Order lacked a sustainable model to support these vast fortifications. The land grants to settlers and knights, promised as a reward for their service, became increasingly unproductive due to constant warfare and a lack of sufficient local labor. By the late 13th century, the Teutonic Order's financial problems became apparent. Their income from trade was undermined by the Hanseatic League, which dominated the Baltic trade routes, leaving the Teutonic Order with few resources to support their growing empire. Their attempts to fund the military system by levying taxes on the local population strained the local economies. As Prussian settlers became more frustrated with their unfulfilled promises and harsh economic conditions, the Teutonic Knights' ability to maintain their authority began to weaken. The Prussian economy was overtaxed, and land, once fertile, became desolate from endless military campaigns. Could the Teutonic Order survive its own militaristic ambitions? Were the economic pressures so great that even the Teutonic Knights' military might would crumble under the weight of internal division and mismanagement? As the Teutonic Knights pressed forward in their campaign against the Prussian tribes, the military pressure they exerted was not the only force at work within the Order's ranks. Tensions were beginning to surface from within. The Order, while unified in its mission of Christianizing the pagan territories, was a fractured organization at its core. The German knights who had established control in the Order's leadership were faced with growing resistance from the Prussian nobility, now forced into a subjugated position. This discontent would soon boil over, and the consequences would be felt throughout the Teutonic state. The Teutonic Knights, by the late 13th century, were not a monolithic entity. The Order was led by the Grand Master and a select few from the German nobility, but beneath the surface, various factions within the Order were starting to gain influence. German knights, who felt an increasing sense of privilege, began pushing for greater autonomy and control over the Prussian territories. Meanwhile, Prussian leaders, whether converts to Christianity or remaining pagan, began to resist the centralized rule imposed by the Teutonic Order. The Teutonic Knights' military commanders, often sent into the frontiers, started developing their own power bases in Prussia, with little oversight from the Order's central leadership. These internal struggles, often masked by the order's military campaigns, began to erode its unity and ability to govern. With more and more knights chasing individual wealth from the land grants and settlements, the militarized state became increasingly unstable. By the time of the Prussian uprisings in the 1260s, Teutonic Knights found their control over the Prussian tribes slipping. Their inability to manage their own military and economic system would lay the groundwork for their eventual collapse. An empire built on religious fervor and military might struggling to balance the feudalism it had imported. Could the Teutonic Order's internal divisions and military strain ever reconcile? Or was the Order's failure to manage its lands, both economically and politically, the beginning of its irreversible decline? In 1525, the winds of change blew across the Baltic region, signaling not just the collapse of an ancient military order but the birth of a new Prussian identity. Albert of Brandenburg, once the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, turned his back on a century-old tradition to create a secular duchy. But this was more than a simple transition of power. It was a cultural revolution that redefined the Prussian state, shaped by the Protestant Reformation and a decade-long struggle for political autonomy. The Teutonic Order's influence in Prussia had long been tied to both military conquest and religious zeal. But by 1525, the Order's power had significantly waned, and Albert of Brandenburg, a man of ambition, saw the opportunity to capitalize on the shifting tides of religion and politics in Europe. The rise of Lutheranism, which had already upended the authority of the Catholic Church, offered Albert a pathway to secularize the Teutonic Order and establish a new Prussian state under his own dynastic control. In this environment, Albert's decision to renounce his religious vows and convert the Teutonic territories into a duchy was not just an act of secularization but a reflection of the broader political currents in Europe. The Protestant Reformation was reshaping the religious and political map of Europe, and Prussia would not be left behind. The Lutheran state that Albert created became a symbol of religious independence and political autonomy. It was a Prussian experiment, an attempt to build a state that embraced religious reform while casting off the constraints of the Catholic Church and the Teutonic Order's military religious mission. The Protestant Reformation was not just a theological movement. It was a political earthquake that shook the very foundation of Europe's old feudal structures. In this context, Albert of Brandenburg made a crucial decision that aligned his new Duchy of Prussia with the growing Protestant tide. By secularizing the Teutonic Order, Albert didn't just abandon the order's religious roots. He also positioned Prussia at the center of a new political and religious order. The Protestant Reformation created an environment in which rulers had to choose between religious loyalty to the Pope and their desire for political autonomy. Albert of Brandenburg, aligning with Lutheran ideals, became the first Prussian ruler to embrace Protestantism fully. His decision reflected the increasing tension between the Catholic Church and European monarchs, many of whom were already resisting the papal authority in favor of their own national churches. By secularizing the Teutonic Order, Albert set the stage for Prussia's rise as a Protestant stronghold, marking the end of the Teutonic Order's religious mission and the dawn of a new era in the Baltic region. This new direction for Prussia, a Lutheran duchy, meant that religious freedom was linked to political sovereignty. Albert's break with the Catholic Church was not only about personal ambition but also about creating a Prussian identity separate from the influences of the Pope. The shift to Lutheranism created an atmosphere of political change where religion and state were closely linked, but the state was no longer beholden to external religious authorities. Prussia became a new political entity that would gradually influence the balance of power in the Baltic, shaping the region for centuries to come. As Albert of Brandenburg declared the Teutonic Order secular and created the Duchy of Prussia, the region was forever changed. The Duchy of Prussia was not just a new state, it was the first Lutheran state in Europe. With its creation, the Teutonic Order's religious mission gave way to a secular monarchy that would evolve into a European powerhouse. But would Albert's vision of a Lutheran Prussia endure? Or would the tensions between Protestantism and the old feudal system tear his new duchy apart? The Duchy of Prussia became a critical player in the European religious wars that were to come. Its Lutheran character positioned it as an ally to the rising Protestant states of Northern Europe, particularly the German princes. Albert's bold move to secularize the Teutonic Order was more than just about land. It was about forging a Prussian identity that was distinct from the Catholic influence of the past. However, his decision to adopt Protestantism was not without its consequences. The duchy's political stability was challenged by internal and external pressures. The tension between the feudal structure and the growing power of Protestant ideas would shape Prussia for centuries. In the early 16th century, Europe found itself at the crossroads of religious revolution and political transformation. The Teutonic Order, once the great warrior monks of the Baltic, now faced an uncertain future. The rise of the Protestant Reformation had already begun to fracture the unity of the Catholic Church, but it also opened new opportunities for rulers like Albert of Brandenburg to assert their political independence. Albert's decision to secularize the Teutonic Order and create the Duchy of Prussia was not just about embracing Protestantism. It was about seizing an opportunity to reshape the balance of power in Europe. The Teutonic Order's decline had been a long time coming. For decades, the Order's leadership had been consumed by internal power struggles, and external challenges from the Hanseatic League and neighboring Catholic states had left the Order financially weakened and politically isolated. The Hohenzollern family, of which Albert was a member, had long harbored ambitions for Prussian autonomy within the Holy Roman Empire. By the early 14th century, the Teutonic Knights had secured their foothold in Prussia. But their success created new desires for more territory, for greater wealth, and for further religious expansion. The Prussian knights, having already converted the local Prussians by the sword, turned their sights on the lands of Livonia and Lithuania, where strong pagan cultures still held sway. Yet, the expansion into these regions was not a simple march. It was a battle on multiple fronts: military conquest, religious conversion, and diplomatic negotiation. In Livonia, the Teutonic Knights faced a patchwork of independent tribes, who were not only fiercely independent but also well-armed and strategically savvy. The Knights first engaged in a series of battles with local resistance forces, but it wasn't until the siege of Tallinn in 1219 that they secured their foothold in the region. The capture of the fortress cities allowed the Order to dominate the trade routes and establish fortified castles, many of which would become centers of administration and military command. Despite their success, the Prussian knights found themselves entangled in diplomatic maneuvers with local Russian and Scandinavian powers, whose interests often conflicted with Teutonic expansion. By the early 15th century, the Teutonic Knights had established a formidable presence in the region, but their control was continuously challenged by local resistance and foreign intervention. In Lithuania, however, the story was far different. This was a land not only rich in resources but one of the last strongholds of paganism in Europe. The Lithuanians had long resisted attempts at Christianization, and their Grand Duchy had grown into one of the largest and most powerful states in Eastern Europe. The Teutonic Order's military campaigns against Lithuania were relentless, but the Lithuanian resistance proved even more formidable. Grand Duke Vytautas, one of the most skilled military tacticians of his time, formed strategic alliances with Poland, effectively countering the Teutonic threat. Despite their significant military setbacks in Lithuania, the Teutonic Knights managed to hold on to key territories, but the Prussian expansion into Lithuania was never fully realized. The Teutonic Knights' expansion into Finland and the surrounding Scandinavian territories marked another chapter of Prussian military ambitions. The region was relatively sparsely populated, but strategically important. The Teutonic Order had to contend not just with military adversaries but also with local Swedish powers and the economic control of the Hanseatic League, whose monopoly over trade made it difficult for the Prussian Knights to maintain control over the region. Yet, the Order's military infrastructure in Finland, coupled with the strong alliances they developed with Swedish nobles, allowed them to maintain a strategic presence in the northern reaches of the Baltic. Nestled between the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, the emerging Polish kingdom, and the powerful Russian principalities, Prussia's geographic position was more than just strategic. It was critical to its future survival and growth. While this territory was initially a place of conquest, it would quickly become the center of a web of economic and military influence. The Prussian territories, surrounded by rival powers, could easily have become a plaything for European monarchs, yet instead, they became the epicenter of a new European power that harnessed both military might and economic acumen. Prussia's location was pivotal. It was the gateway between East and West. The Baltic Sea served as the trade highway connecting the rapidly developing mercantile economies of the Hanoverian and Habsburg territories with the vast resources of Eastern Europe and Russia. The Vistula River, which cut through Prussia, was not only a trade route but also a military corridor. Control over this strategic waterway allowed Prussia to dominate the passage of grain, timber, and amber into the Western markets, providing the Teutonic Order with the financial leverage to fund its military expansion. The economic importance of this territory could not be overstated. In the early 14th century, the Teutonic Order effectively controlled the Baltic trade routes, with key ports in Danzig and Riga. However, as Hanseatic merchant networks grew in power, Prussia's commercial monopoly began to be challenged by rival trading alliances. The Hanseatic League, a commercial consortium that dominated trade in Northern Europe, sought to undermine Prussia's trade, particularly by controlling ports and shipping routes in the Baltic. Would Prussia's reliance on the Hanseatic League's trade routes and their military might be enough to maintain control, or would the growing influence of these rival commercial powers tip the balance of economic and political power in the region? Beneath the growing economic base, the Teutonic Knights were the unseen hands that would wield power across Prussia's borders. With their cavalry charging across the Baltic fields, fortifications rising on key trade routes, and an unwavering zeal to enforce their Christianity, the Knights were more than just soldiers. They were the builders of a militarized society. As Prussia expanded, so too did the military innovations that allowed the Teutonic Order to control such vast swathes of territory. The military strength of the Teutonic Knights was unmatched in the early 14th century. Their heavy cavalry tactics, drawn from Crusader traditions, were honed in the conquest of the pagan Prussians, but these strategies were soon applied to new territories in Livonia and Lithuania. Castles, such as Marienburg, were not just fortifications but also administrative centers that enabled the knights to govern as they expanded. These fortresses dotted the Baltic coast and were built with advanced military engineering, stone structures designed to withstand sieges and fortify control over the region. However, the militarization of the Teutonic Order wasn't just about conquest. It was about economic integration. The Order's military campaigns were closely linked to the development of trade networks in the Baltic Sea. As they expanded their territories, the Knights built a network of castles and trading posts to control the flow of goods, notably grain, timber, and amber, from the interior to Western Europe. They understood that the military conquest of a territory was meaningless without the ability to sustain and exploit it economically. Yet, despite their military successes, the Teutonic Order was not invincible. As the Hanseatic League grew stronger and as Poland and Lithuania began to consolidate, the Knights found themselves facing an array of rivals on both military and diplomatic fronts. This would lead to a series of conflicts, the most significant being the Battle of Tannenberg, 1410, which would decisively alter the course of Prussian military history. With their military might and fortified castles, the Teutonic Knights had gained a solid foothold in the Baltic region. But with growing threats from Poland, Lithuania, and the Hanseatic League, could Prussia maintain its dominance, or would the Knights' power start to wane, leaving the future of Prussia's economic and political hegemony in jeopardy? Behind every military conquest of Prussia was a growing realization that economic control was as important as territorial control. The Teutonic Knights, having successfully expanded their borders, now needed to turn their growing empire into a commercial powerhouse. It was not enough to conquer land. They needed to harness the resources of the land, develop trade routes, and ensure that Prussia became a profitable hub of European commerce. The Vistula River played an essential role in Prussia's economic rise. Through its port cities, including Gdansk, Prussia gained access to the lucrative markets of Western Europe. By the late 14th century, Prussia was one of the leading producers of grain, timber, and amber, all of which were highly prized by European traders. The Teutonic Knights understood that the control of trade routes was vital to their survival. Prussia's ports became critical nodes in the Baltic trade system, through which they could not only transport goods but also tax merchants, ensuring a steady revenue stream. Prussia's growing economic base allowed the Teutonic Knights to fortify their military presence while simultaneously building a self-sustaining economy. Agricultural settlements, established throughout the region, helped feed the order's military while providing goods to support the construction of castles and fortifications. By the mid-15th century, Prussia had become the economic engine of the Teutonic Order, which allowed it to continue expanding its military influence throughout the Baltic. But the Prussian economic success would not go unchallenged. The rise of Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden posed direct threats to Prussia's control over trade routes. The Hanseatic League, now in competition with Prussia's merchants, sought to undermine the Teutonic monopoly. This rivalry sparked a series of economic battles, with Prussia defending its newfound wealth and influence in the Baltic through both diplomacy and military force. Could Prussia's economic dominance withstand the rising pressures from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Hanseatic League, or would this economic rivalry become the trigger for future conflicts that would define Prussia's place in European power struggles? As the Teutonic Knights established their foothold in the Baltic, Prussia's political role in European affairs evolved dramatically. Initially, the order's focus was on territorial expansion, but by the early 15th century, it became clear that Prussia's military strength and economic power could not be sustained in isolation. The growing political complexity of Europe, with its shifting alliances and emerging Protestant movements, meant that Prussia had to navigate the region's geopolitical landscape carefully. By the time of the Treaty of Thorn, 1466, Prussia found itself in a political bind. The Teutonic Order's territories were divided into Royal Prussia, which came under the control of Poland, and the Duchy of Prussia, which remained under the Order's control but was now a vassal state of the Polish crown. This diplomatic compromise allowed Prussia to maintain its autonomy, but it also forced the Order to align itself with Poland on key political issues. The Duchy of Prussia, having become a Lutheran territory under Albert of Brandenburg in 1525, was now aligned with Protestant Europe and firmly opposed the Catholic powers of Europe. As Prussia grew in political importance, its relationship with the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, and Lithuania became increasingly complex. The political stability of Prussia depended on its ability to navigate religious divisions, trade routes, and the changing tides of diplomacy in an increasingly divided Europe. Prussia's place in the European power structure was cemented by its ability to leverage economic and military influence against both Catholic and Protestant adversaries. The year was 1410, and the mighty Teutonic Knights, once feared and revered, had just suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in their long military history. The Battle of Tannenberg, a fierce and bloody conflict, not only shattered the pride of the Teutonic Order but also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Duchy of Prussia. Yet, instead of collapsing into irrelevance, Prussia would be reborn, not just through military might, but through a combination of religious transformation, diplomatic alliances, and a shrewd understanding of European geopolitics. The Battle of Tannenberg, 1410, was a pivotal moment in European history. While the Teutonic Knights had once held sway over vast territories in the Baltic, their defeat at the hands of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance proved that Prussia's military dominance could no longer be maintained without adapting to the changing realities of the European political landscape. For Prussia, the military defeat led to a significant political restructuring. The Teutonic Knights, although weakened, still controlled large swathes of land, but their military strength was eroded, leaving the Duchy of Prussia vulnerable to internal dissent and external threats. Yet, this decline catalyzed a transformation. Albert of Brandenburg, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, recognized that the path forward was not through military dominance but through political maneuvering, an understanding that would shape Prussia's trajectory for centuries to come. Prussia's military defeat did not mark the collapse of the Teutonic Order, but rather, its transformation into a more politically astute power. The order's transition from a military monastic order to a secular duchy marked the beginning of Prussia's consolidation of power. By 1525, with Albert of Brandenburg renouncing his position as Grand Master, the order's territories were formally secularized, creating the Duchy of Prussia, a Protestant territory under Polish suzerainty but with its own military and political ambitions. In a time when the bonds of dynastic marriage were just as valuable as military conquest, Prussia's future hinged not only on battlefield victories but also on carefully negotiated alliances forged through blood and marriage. The Hohenzollern family, after securing Prussia's secular independence from the Teutonic Knights, sought to strengthen their claim to the duchy and expand their influence in Europe through strategic marriages. These marriages were not mere ceremonies, they were tools of diplomacy, designed to integrate Prussia into the complex web of European politics. One of the earliest and most significant alliances was the marriage of Albert of Brandenburg to Marie of Poland in 1476. This union not only bolstered Prussia's legitimacy within the Polish-Lithuanian Union but also strengthened Poland's control over Prussia, positioning the duchy as a Polish vassal. While this marriage granted Prussia access to Poland's political support, it also placed Prussia under the influence of Poland at a time when Prussia's independence was still a volatile issue. This complex balance between dependence and autonomy would define Prussia's future for much of the 16th century. Another marriage of strategic importance was that of Albert's son George of Brandenburg to Marie of Poland, which further tied the Prussian nobility to the Polish crown. These alliances set the stage for Prussia's continued growth, as the Hohenzollern family formed bonds with other European houses, including the Habsburgs and the Swedes. The Hohenzollern marriage strategy ensured that Prussia was woven into the broader political and military alliances of Northern Europe, making it a key player in the Protestant Reformation and its subsequent conflicts. But while marriage alliances strengthened Prussia's position, they also presented a new set of risks. Would Prussia be able to maintain its political independence with growing ties to Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, or would these alliances eventually lead to subordination and the dilution of Prussia's unique identity? By the early 16th century, Europe was a continent divided by religious upheaval. Lutheranism was on the rise and Prussia, previously a staunch Catholic military order, was on the brink of a Protestant revolution. The secularization of the Teutonic Order laid the groundwork for Prussia's embrace of Lutheranism, and as Prussia transitioned into a Protestant duchy, it began to align itself with the growing Protestant states of Northern Europe. But this shift was more than just religious. It was a bold political move that would define Prussia as a key player in the Protestant struggle against Catholic Europe. Under Albert of Brandenburg, the duchy formally adopted Lutheranism, severing its ties with the Catholic Church and aligning with the Lutheran princes in Germany. This shift was not merely theological, it was also political. The Hohenzollern family, eager to consolidate their power, recognized that the Protestant Reformation offered a unique opportunity to break free from the Habsburgs' Catholic dominance and align with the growing Protestant movements across Germany and Scandinavia. The Hohenzollern family also cleverly used their Protestant alliances to protect their interests and to push back against the Habsburgs, whose attempts to maintain Catholic hegemony in Europe were threatening Prussia's growing autonomy. As Prussia's Protestant identity became more firmly entrenched, it gained powerful allies in the Protestant League, which included the Swedes, the Danish and the German Protestant states. Prussia became a profoundly important player in the Protestant wars that would follow, with its newly solidified position giving it not only religious strength but also a military foothold to assert its political dominance. Would Prussia's Protestant alliances secure its place in the religious wars of Europe, or would the Catholic Habsburgs and their alliances see Prussia as a threat too great to ignore? Though Prussia had gained substantial autonomy after the Treaty of Thorn, 1466, its relationship with Poland remained crucial. Poland, despite being a Catholic kingdom, provided Prussia with protection, economic stability, and strategic positioning in the Baltic Sea. But by the late 16th century, the once cordial relationship between the Polish crown and Prussia began to fray. As Prussia's ambitions grew, its rulers sought to further distance themselves from Poland, while Poland sought to retain its control over the duchy. The Duchy of Prussia's relationship with Poland remained a key factor in its evolution. Though Prussia was a Lutheran state, its Catholic suzerainty to Poland created tensions between its desire for independence and its reliance on Polish support. Prussia's political and military autonomy was continually challenged by Poland's growing influence in Eastern Europe. As Poland navigated its own internal struggles, balancing between Catholicism and Protestantism, Prussia faced the growing challenge of asserting its own political identity. The increasingly fractious relationship between Prussia and Poland would eventually culminate in Prussia's full independence, with the Hohenzollern family's strategic maneuvering pushing back against the Polish crown's authority. As tensions between Prussia and Poland escalated, would the Hohenzollerns finally sever all ties, or would the struggle for Prussian independence come at the cost of further political conflict with one of Europe's most powerful Catholic monarchies? By the dawn of the 17th century, Prussia had transformed from a military order to a secular duchy that had secured its place as a Protestant power in Eastern Europe. The Hohenzollern family's diplomatic acumen, strategic marriages, and careful alliances had positioned Prussia as a key player in the power struggles of Europe. But as the century continued, Prussia's increasing military ambitions and its growing economic clout would push it into the heart of European conflict, and into the world stage. In the coming decades, Prussia would face increasing challenges, both internally from Poland and the Catholic monarchies, and externally from the rising Habsburgs, Sweden, and even Russia. Yet the groundwork for Prussia's rise to global prominence was already being laid. Would Prussia's carefully constructed alliances and economic power be enough to hold off the growing pressures from Catholic Europe and the rise of the Habsburgs, or would the Teutonic legacy finally give way to Prussian independence? In the aftermath of the Battle of Tannenberg, 1410, the Teutonic Order found itself on the defensive. But instead of fading into obscurity, this catastrophic military defeat served as the crucible in which Prussia's future was forged. The Teutonic Knights would not fall easily, rather they would adapt, using bureaucratic genius and diplomatic savvy to hold onto their territories and establish the foundations of a new state that would shape the future of Europe. The Teutonic Knights' military supremacy was forged on the back of Crusader zeal and fortified castles that dotted the landscape of Eastern Europe. Their military system, centered on heavy cavalry, was one of the most effective of its time. But the Battle of Tannenberg demonstrated that military might alone would not suffice in a world shifting under the weight of religious upheavals and growing political sophistication. Faced with the Polish-Lithuanian alliance, the Teutonic Order realized that to maintain its power over the Baltic, it needed more than just soldiers. It needed a sophisticated bureaucracy capable of managing its sprawling territory. Following the Battle of Tannenberg, the Teutonic Order shifted from a purely military structure to one that integrated administrative and economic functions into its governance. The Order's military fortresses such as Marienburg became not only fortifications but also centers of governance, where military officers, administrators and clerics worked in tandem to manage land distribution, taxation, and the extraction of resources from the conquered territories. These military and bureaucratic innovations set the stage for what would become the Prussian state, a model of militarized administration that would, in the coming centuries, come to dominate Northern Europe. Secularization was not merely a shift in religious affiliation but a profound transformation of the order's political identity. Albert of Brandenburg's decision to secularize the Teutonic Order in 1525 marked the end of the military-religious crusading legacy of the Knights. Instead, Prussia became a Protestant duchy under Polish suzerainty. However, this transition did not lead to the collapse of power. Rather, it paved the way for the Hohenzollern dynasty's rise. The Teutonic Order's administrative practices, such as its methods of taxation, resource extraction and military recruitment, were seamlessly transferred into the Duchy of Prussia, helping to create a state that, despite its fragile political position, would eventually become a formidable European power. The Hohenzollern dynasty, now at the helm of the Duchy of Prussia, knew that dynastic marriages were not just matters of tradition. They were weapons of diplomacy, critical tools for expanding Prussia's influence. In an age where political ties were forged in the bedchambers of Europe's royal houses, the Hohenzollerns, through careful marital alliances, began weaving Prussia into the larger European political fabric. The Hohenzollern dynasty's first masterstroke was the marriage of Albert of Brandenburg to Marie of Poland in 1476, a move that solidified Prussia's ties to Poland, granting Prussia protection and prestige under Polish suzerainty. This marriage strategically aligned Prussia with one of Eastern Europe's most powerful kingdoms, positioning Prussia as an indispensable ally to Poland, but also as a vassal state, dependent on the Polish crown for security and legitimacy. This dynastic alliance, however, proved to be a double-edged sword. While it afforded Prussia protection and ensured its religious transition from Catholicism to Lutheranism, it also positioned the duchy under Poland's influence, a condition that would be a thorn in Prussia's side for generations. The Hohenzollerns, however, were not content with mere survival. They had ambitions. The secularization of the Teutonic Order and the Lutheran Reformation gave them the freedom to pursue their own destiny. The marriage of Albert's son, George of Brandenburg, to Marie of Poland further cemented Prussia's ties to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but also introduced a new wave of political maneuvering. The Hohenzollerns were laying the groundwork for a future in which Prussia's independence would eventually be won through both diplomatic cunning and military prowess. However, the Polish connection also left Prussia vulnerable to Poland's influence, and this marital alliance would later come to a head as Prussia sought to assert its independence from Polish suzerainty. The challenge, however, was clear. While the Hohenzollerns secured alliances, they were also navigating the tightrope between Poland's patronage and the growing desire for Prussian autonomy. The Protestant Reformation was a revolution that redefined Europe's religious map, and Prussia, with its Lutheran leanings, became one of its most significant players. The Teutonic Order's transition from Catholicism to Lutheranism was not just theological. It was also a political act that firmly positioned Prussia in the Protestant camp, a decision with vast implications for its political future. In 1525, as Albert of Brandenburg officially secularized the Teutonic Order, the Duchy of Prussia embraced Lutheranism as its state religion, severing its ties with the Catholic Church and establishing itself as a Protestant stronghold in Eastern Europe. The decision to embrace Lutheranism was not simply ideological. It was a calculated political move, designed to distinguish Prussia from the Catholic powers of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, and to align the duchy with the growing Protestant powers of Germany and Scandinavia. The shift to Protestantism allowed Prussia to strengthen its military alliances with Sweden and the Lutheran princes of Germany, both of whom were eager to see the Habsburgs and Catholic Europe weakened. Yet this decision also alienated Catholic powers, notably the Habsburg Empire and Poland, who now viewed Prussia as a dangerous Protestant enclave on their eastern flank. The Hohenzollern family understood that their religious position in Prussia would not only define their internal politics but also influence their external alliances. Prussia's shift to Protestantism also allowed the Hohenzollerns to align themselves with Luther's reforms, which included the seizure of church lands and the imposition of Lutheran religious practices across Prussian society. This gave the Hohenzollerns considerable control over the economic resources of the duchy, which had been tied up in the church prior to the Reformation. The Prussian Reformation thus marked a dual transformation, religious and political, allowing Prussia to assert its independence from Catholic domination and play a leading role in the Protestant cause in Eastern Europe. By the close of the 16th century, Prussia stood on the precipice of becoming one of Europe's most dominant forces. From its Teutonic military roots, through its secularization and religious transformation, Prussia had mastered the arts of warfare, bureaucratic control, and diplomatic maneuvering. The legacy of the Teutonic Order had provided the Hohenzollern dynasty with the tools to build an empire, and Prussia's next steps would pave the way for its eventual rise as the Prussian kingdom in the 18th century. In the centuries following the Teutonic Order's dissolution, Prussia's power would be shaped by the inherited systems of military and bureaucratic governance. The Teutonic Knights' legacy of fortified castles, administrative efficiency, and religious zeal laid the foundation for Prussia's military and political might, which, by the 18th century, would propel it into the ranks of Europe's great powers. Prussia's legacy was built not only on its conquests but on its ability to transform itself from a religious military order into a secular Protestant state that deftly navigated the growing tensions in Europe. From the Polish-Lithuanian territories to the rising Hohenzollern dynasty, Prussia's evolution was far from linear. It was a testament to the enduring legacy of the Teutonic Order, whose influence would ripple through European history, shaping the future of Prussia and Europe alike. Would Prussia's legacy, shaped by centuries of military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering, continue to secure its future as a leading power in Europe? Or would the forces of Catholic Europe, driven by religious and political conflict, seek to undermine Prussia's hard-won sovereignty? The Teutonic Order's transformation from a Catholic military order to a secular Duchy of Prussia was one of the most complex and monumental shifts in European history. Emerging as crusaders and warriors of faith, the Order's role in Prussia had always been marked by their strategic focus on land acquisition, military campaigns, and the conversion of pagans. Yet, by the early 16th century the political landscape had changed drastically. The Teutonic Knights, battered by defeats such as Tannenberg and under pressure from the Catholic Church and Protestant Reformation, were forced to rethink their role. What happened next was a quiet revolution. The secularization of the Teutonic Order, a result of the Lutheran Reformation and the profound political shift under Albert of Brandenburg, would lay the groundwork for the Duchy of Prussia. Albert's decision to renounce religious vows and accept the Lutheran faith was not only a religious break from the Catholic Church, but a bold political maneuver that allowed Prussia to avoid the fate of being absorbed into Catholic states. This secularization gave rise to a militarized bureaucracy, where administration, taxation, and military service became deeply intertwined. At the core of Prussia's transition was its bureaucratic system, which had been cultivated by the Teutonic Knights for centuries. The Teutonic castles were not simply fortresses but centers of governance, housing military commanders, clerics, and local rulers who managed the land and its resources. These fortresses, such as Marienburg, were the heart of the Prussian state. Prussia's militarization and centralized control would later serve as a model for the Hohenzollern dynasty. As Prussia became a secular state, the key elements of feudal military control and state administration passed seamlessly from the Teutonic Knights to the Hohenzollerns, who would eventually use these systems to build a European empire. With the Teutonic Order's secularization, the Hohenzollern family emerged as the driving force behind Prussia's future. Their military acumen and diplomatic strategies were paramount to Prussia's survival in an era of shifting alliances and complex political realities. In an age where dynastic marriages could dictate the fate of a state, the Hohenzollerns used their strategic marriages to consolidate power and protect Prussia's sovereignty. One of the key alliances was the marriage of Albert of Brandenburg to Marie of Poland in 1476. This union cemented Prussia's ties to Poland, securing a degree of protection but also placing Prussia under Polish suzerainty. Though this positioned Prussia as a vassal of Poland, it also allowed the Hohenzollern family to manipulate the Polish political system, effectively ensuring Prussia's survival while using Poland's strength to bolster its military and economic interests. These marriages were more than simple alliances. They were political weapons in an ongoing battle to maintain independence and expand Prussian influence. The Hohenzollern family also smartly leveraged alliances with Protestant states such as Sweden and Denmark, enhancing Prussia's power as the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe. The Lutheran faith, adopted by Prussia, was strategically aligned with Protestant reformers throughout Germany, solidifying Prussia's position in the Protestant cause. However, these alliances also made Prussia a target for Catholic monarchies, particularly the Habsburgs, whose expansionist ambitions in the Baltic and Eastern Europe posed a constant threat to Prussia's growing sovereignty. Prussia's diplomatic success during this period should not be underestimated. The Hohenzollerns played their hand cautiously, knowing that the survival of the duchy depended not only on alliances but on knowing when to stand firm and when to bend. These strategies would later be tested as Prussia's ambitions for independence from Poland and the Habsburgs grew. The Protestant Reformation transformed the very nature of Prussia's identity. Prior to 1525, the Teutonic Order had been a Catholic military religious order, bound to the Pope and tasked with spreading Christianity through conquest. However, as Lutheranism spread across Europe, Prussia found itself in a unique position. Lutheranism's popularity in Germany made Protestantism the logical choice for a secularized Prussia, a move that would define its political future. The Hohenzollerns' conversion to Lutheranism in the early 1520s aligned Prussia with the growing Protestant movement. It gave Prussia a strong ideological foothold in the religious wars that would follow, but it also marked the beginning of Prussia's political transformation. This shift was deeply connected to Prussia's diplomatic alliances, as it allowed Prussia to leverage its Protestant identity to form powerful alliances with the Protestant princes of Germany and Northern Europe. While Poland, the Catholic superpower, remained a suzerain to Prussia, the Protestant shift distanced Prussia from Catholic Europe, creating a divide that would influence the course of their relationship. Furthermore, the Prussian Reformation was more than just a religious revolution. It was a political act that allowed Prussia to consolidate its territorial claims and enhance its autonomy from Poland. With Lutheranism in place, Prussia moved further away from its Polish overlord and began to build its own distinct national identity as a Protestant duchy. The religious and political transformation that Prussia underwent in this period paved the way for its future successes, and its eventual dominance in Northern Europe. Would Prussia's bold embrace of Protestantism lead it to even greater political heights, or would it become a pawn in the religious wars of Europe, caught between Catholic and Protestant powers? As the Hohenzollern dynasty solidified its rule in Prussia, the state's legacy of militarized bureaucracy became its enduring hallmark. The Teutonic Order's bureaucratic and military systems, far from dying with the secularization of the order, became the backbone of Prussia's future success. The fortified castles and military regiments of the Teutonic Knights were passed down, refined, and adapted by Prussia's new secular rulers to form a highly centralized state with a highly disciplined military. Yet, this militarization was not without its limits. The Hohenzollerns, keenly aware of their own dependence on European alliances, continued to navigate the complex web of Catholic and Protestant diplomacy. By 1618, Prussia had become a formidable political player but remained at the mercy of the larger powers of Europe, particularly Poland and the Habsburgs. Ultimately, Prussia's transformation was one of gradual military consolidation, bureaucratic sophistication, and diplomatic savvy. The Hohenzollern dynasty, building on the foundations of the Teutonic Knights, used their power to ensure Prussia's independence and regional dominance, though they would soon face the tensions of future conflict and growing external challenges. Prussia's history, shaped by its military might and strategic alliances, would continue to be defined by its ability to adapt, from a religious military order to the secular Protestant duchy and eventually, to the Prussian kingdom. It is a legacy that underscores the complexity of European power dynamics, shaped by the military, bureaucratic, and diplomatic innovations of an evolving state. If you're fascinated by how Prussia rose from the ashes of pagan resistance and crusading conquest to become one of Europe's most powerful states, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next chapter in this epic saga. Join us as we uncover the untold stories of the Teutonic Order, the Hohenzollern dynasty, and the making of Prussia. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like and share with others who love history as much as you do. Let's continue exploring the hidden paths that shape the world we live in today.